November 7th, 1944. 03:15 hours. The Hürtgen Forest, Western Germany. Hauptmann Werner Schulze crouched in his command post, little more than a reinforced dugout carved into the frozen earth, as he reviewed the attack plan for the dawn assault. His company of the 275th Infantry Regiment had spent the past week preparing for this counterattack against American positions. They had trained for years in the tactics of the Blitzkrieg, the swift coordinated strikes that had brought them victory across Europe. But in the darkness before dawn, as Schulze listened to the distant rumble of American artillery, he felt something he had never experienced in Poland, in France, or even during the early campaigns in Russia. He felt dread. At precisely 03:45, Schulze's radio operator received the order. The attack would commence in 15 minutes. The company began moving from their assembly area toward the American positions, using the pre-dawn darkness for concealment. They advanced in textbook fashion, maintaining proper intervals, moving through the dense forest with the discipline of professional soldiers. For 8 minutes, everything proceeded according to plan. Then the world ended. There was no warning, no ranging shot, no gradual increase in fire. The next, the entire forest erupted in simultaneous detonation. Schulze would later estimate that at least 200 shells struck his company's position within the first 3 seconds. Men simply vanished, torn apart by high explosive and steel fragments that shredded everything within a 30-meter radius of each impact. The survivors, fewer than 40 men from a company of 180, stumbled back to German lines in shock. Schulze himself received shrapnel wounds to his left arm and face, but the physical wounds were not what haunted him. It was the realization that had crystallized in those 3 seconds of annihilation. The Americans had known exactly where his company would be. They had pre-registered their artillery on that exact grid square, and when the moment came, they had fired every available gun simultaneously, achieving perfect coordination across multiple batteries positioned miles apart. No defense works against this, Schulze told his battalion commander during the after-action briefing. They fire 10 rounds per minute from each gun, and they have unlimited ammunition. We cannot dig deep enough. We cannot disperse widely enough. We cannot move fast enough. Traditional defensive tactics are obsolete. This was not hyperbole. This was the terrified assessment of a combat-experienced officer who had just witnessed the true capability of American artillery in World War II. What Schulze and thousands of other German soldiers discovered in the forests of Western Germany, in the hedgerows of Normandy, and across every battlefield where they faced the Americans, was that they were fighting an enemy whose artillery had transcended traditional limitations. The Americans had not simply built more guns or stockpiled more ammunition, though they had done both. They had created an entirely new system of fire support that made German defensive doctrine irrelevant. The story of how American artillery achieved this crushing superiority began not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the training grounds and proving facilities of the United States during the years between the wars, when a small group of innovative officers revolutionized the science of indirect fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. During the 1930s, while European armies prepared for the next war by refining the tactics of the last one, American artillery officers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, were quietly developing techniques that were to transform warfare. The revolution began with a fundamental question: how could multiple artillery batteries, positioned miles apart and equipped with different types of guns, coordinate their fire to achieve maximum effect? The traditional answer involved terrain-based fire control. Batteries would mass their fire on a visible landmark or a specific grid coordinate, with each battery firing independently. This produced acceptable results, but it was slow, imprecise, and vulnerable to German defensive measures. Carlos Brewer, director of gunnery at Fort Sill, proposed an entirely different approach. Instead of using terrain features, batteries would use mathematically precise survey-based positioning. Instead of firing independently, they would coordinate through centralized fire direction centers that computed firing data for all batteries simultaneously. In the spring of 1931, Fort Sill demonstrated the first successful battalion mass fire using these new methods. The implications were revolutionary. For the first time, artillery commanders could coordinate dozens of guns firing at different angles, from different positions, to strike a single target with scientific precision. But precision alone was not enough. The Americans developed something even more devastating: time on target, a technique where shells from multiple batteries would impact simultaneously, regardless of the varying distances, elevations, and gun types. The mathematics were staggering. A 105mm howitzer firing from 5,000 meters required different flight time than a 155mm howitzer firing from 8,000 meters. Add variations for wind, temperature, barrel wear, and propellant temperature, and the calculations became extraordinarily complex. Yet American fire direction centers mastered these calculations. By 1941, when the United States entered the war, American artillery doctrine routinely incorporated time on target missions that German artillery officers would have considered impossible. The weapons themselves represented American industrial capacity at its peak. The M2 A1 105mm howitzer became the backbone of divisional artillery. Entering production in 1941, it could fire a 33-pound high-explosive shell to a range of 12,330 yards, approximately 7 miles. But its true advantage was not range, it was rate of fire. A well-trained crew could sustain 3 rounds per minute indefinitely. For short bursts, exceptional crews achieved 10 rounds per minute. This meant that a single battery of 6 guns could place 60 shells on target in 1 minute, or 18 shells per minute sustained. Compare this to German capabilities. The German LFH 18 105mm howitzer, while technically excellent, faced crippling ammunition shortages. By late 1944, German divisional artillery was often restricted to 50 rounds per gun per day. American artillery faced no such restrictions. A typical American infantry division in heavy combat fired approximately 10,000 rounds per day. The Americans had not just built better guns. They had built an entire system designed to deliver overwhelming firepower continuously. Lieutenant Heinrich Bauer of the 79th Infantry Division experienced American artillery for the first time during the Normandy campaign. His account, recorded during post-war interrogation, captures the German perspective. We had been trained that artillery preparation before an attack would last hours, allowing time to take cover in deep bunkers. The Americans taught us differently. On July 28, 1944, my platoon was in defensive positions near Street Gilles. We heard American tanks approaching. I ordered my men to prepare for action. Before we could properly man our positions, the artillery began. Not gradually, not with ranging shots. Instantly, the entire position was under fire. I estimated 200 shells in the first minute. My platoon ceased to exist in 90 seconds. I was knocked unconscious by blast overpressure. When I woke, 23 of my 38 men were dead or wounded. Bauer's experience was not exceptional. It was systematic. American artillery doctrine emphasized speed of response and volume of fire. When a forward observer identified a target, the fire mission was transmitted to a fire direction center. Trained personnel converted the observer's call into precise firing data for multiple batteries. The entire process, from initial observation to first rounds impacting, typically required 4 to 5 minutes for emergency missions. For planned fires, the coordination could involve dozens of batteries striking simultaneously. The forward observer system itself was revolutionary. American artillery assigned specially trained officers and enlisted men to accompany infantry units into combat. These observers carried radio equipment that allowed direct communication with fire direction centers. When they identified targets, they could request fire from any artillery unit within range, not just their assigned battery. This flexibility meant that a single lieutenant with a radio could theoretically direct fire from every gun in a corps, potentially hundreds of tubes. Feldwebel Otto Kraus of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division encountered this capability during a reconnaissance patrol near Mortain in August 1944. My squad was crossing an open field, visible for perhaps 30 seconds. We reached the tree line and believed ourselves safe. Then, the trees exploded. The Americans had observed us for half a minute and brought artillery fire down in less than 3 minutes. In Russia, Soviet artillery would take 15 to 20 minutes to respond to such a fleeting target. The Americans did it before we could move 200 meters. The psychological impact of this rapid response was profound. German medical officers documented a condition they termed artillery neurosis, a specific fear of American guns, distinct from conventional shell shock. Dr. Friedrich Müller, a Wehrmacht medical officer captured in the Falaise pocket, wrote in his clinical notes, "The men fear American artillery more than Soviet artillery, more than British artillery, more than fighter bombers, aircraft you can see and hear approaching. Soviet artillery builds gradually, allowing time to seek cover. American artillery strikes without warning. The shells simply arrive, simultaneously, overwhelming entire positions in seconds. This creates constant anxiety that degrades combat effectiveness even when no fire is falling." The Americans achieved this systematic dominance through integration of multiple capabilities. Fire direction centers at battalion, division, and corps levels maintained constant communication. Forward observers with frontline infantry called targets directly. Aerial observation from L-4 Grasshopper aircraft militarized Piper Cubs provided eyes deep into German rear areas. Sound ranging and flash spotting located German batteries for counter-battery fire. Signal intelligence identified German headquarters and command posts. All of this information fed into fire direction centers that could coordinate response within minutes. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, an artillery officer with the 116th Panzer Division, witnessed this integration during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 17, 1944, my battery of 105mm guns was positioned near Bastogne, supporting the offensive. We had camouflaged carefully over 2 nights. At 0830 hours, I observed an American observation aircraft, we called them artillery spotters, circling at altitude. I knew we had minutes at most. I ordered immediate displacement. We had unlimbered 3 of 6 guns when the American fire mission arrived. Not a single gun, not a battery. What sounded like an entire battalion struck our position. All 6 guns were destroyed in under 15 seconds. The crews who survived the initial impacts were killed by subsequent rounds that walked across our displacement route. The ammunition itself represented another American advantage. By late 1944, American artillery was firing proximity-fuzzed shells in large quantities. These VT fuses for variable time used radio waves to detonate shells at optimal height above the ground, typically 20 to 30 feet. The airburst effect showered shrapnel over a wide area, defeating the protection of foxholes and trenches. Grenadier Kurt Zimmermann described his first encounter with proximity fuses during fighting in the Ardennes. We trained to drop prone when we heard incoming shells, to minimize exposure to fragments. Against conventional shells, this technique was effective. But the American shells exploded above us. The shrapnel came straight down. Half my squad was killed or wounded by a barrage that would have caused minimal casualties with conventional fuses. German attempts to counter American artillery proved largely futile. Traditional counter-battery fire required locating enemy guns, computing firing solutions, and delivering suppressive fire. But American batteries displayed rapidly, often moving within minutes of completing a fire mission. Even when German observers successfully located American guns and called in counter-battery fire, the American batteries had often displaced before German shells arrived. The fundamental asymmetry was unsustainable. German artillery had to conserve ammunition, fire from fixed positions due to lack of motor transport, and operate with degraded communication systems. American artillery had unlimited ammunition, complete motorization, allowing rapid displacement, and robust radio communications that functioned under all conditions. Major Hans Krebs, operations officer for the 2nd Panzer Division, analyzed this disparity in a report written shortly before his capture in March 1945. The enemy's artillery superiority is not primarily numerical, though they possess many more guns than we do. It is systematic. A single American forward observer with a company of infantry can bring fire from a division's artillery within minutes. We cannot match this because we lack the communications equipment, the ammunition stocks, and the organizational doctrine. More fundamentally, we lack the motor transport to make our artillery mobile enough to survive American counter-battery fire. The German assessment was accurate. American artillery units were completely motorized. The M2 105mm howitzer was typically towed by the M4 high-speed tractor, a tracked vehicle that could pull the gun across difficult terrain at speeds up to 35 miles per hour. The M1 155mm howitzer was towed by the M5 high-speed tractor. This complete mechanization gave American artillery tactical mobility that horse-drawn German guns simply could not match. An American artillery battalion could displace from one firing position to another in under an hour unlimber, move several miles, re-emplace, and resume firing. German batteries required hours to accomplish the same movement, and many German guns remained horse-drawn throughout the war. Oberst Wilhelm von Schell, who commanded artillery for the 9th Panzer Division, wrote in his post-war memoir, "American artillery tactics exploited their mobility ruthlessly. They would fire intensive missions for 5 to 10 minutes, then displace before we could organize effective counter-battery fire. By the time our shells arrived at their previous position, they were established in a new location and resuming fire. This constant displacement made it nearly impossible to suppress their batteries, using traditional methods. But the ultimate expression of American artillery power was not tactical mobility or rate of fire. It was the ability to mass unprecedented quantities of firepower on command. This capability reached its apex during the crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945, when American artillery demonstrated firepower at a scale that shattered German defensive doctrine forever. Operation Plunder, the code name for the Rhine crossing by the United States Ninth Army, represented the culmination of everything American artillery had learned and perfected since 1941. On the night of March 23, 1945, more than 1,500 American artillery pieces were positioned along the western bank of the Rhine. These ranged from divisional 105mm howitzers to corps-level 155mm guns to massive 240mm howitzers, the Black Dragons capable of firing 360-pound shells over 14 miles. The bombardment plan was mathematically precise. Every battery had pre-registered targets on the eastern bank. Fire direction centers had computed firing data for multiple meteorological conditions. Ammunition had been stockpiled in quantities that would have been unimaginable to German commanders. At 2100 hours on March 23rd, the bombardment commenced. General William Simpson and General Dwight Eisenhower observed the barrage from a specially constructed vantage point on the western bank. What they witnessed was unprecedented in the history of warfare. The entire western bank of the Rhine, for miles in both directions, lit up simultaneously with muzzle flashes. The sound was not individual gun reports but continuous thunder that could be heard for 30 miles. Over 65,000 rounds were fired in the initial bombardment. In some sectors, the rate of fire exceeded 1,000 rounds per minute, meaning more than 16 shells impacting every second. Oberst Friedrich Ackermann commanded the 84th Infantry Division defending the Rhine crossing sector. His division had been reinforced specifically to hold against the anticipated American assault. Ackermann had positioned his troops in depth, with multiple defensive lines extending inland from the river. His men occupied reinforced positions that had taken weeks to prepare. They had interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery defensive concentrations, and reserves positioned for immediate counterattack. On paper, the defense was formidable. In reality, it lasted less than 12 hours. Ackermann's account, recorded during post-war interrogation, provides devastating testimony to American artillery effectiveness. The bombardment began at 2100 hours. I had experienced Soviet artillery preparations that lasted hours. I had survived British bombardments at El Alamein. Nothing prepared me for what the Americans delivered. The intensity did not build gradually. It began at maximum violence and sustained that violence for hours. My forward positions simply ceased to exist. Bunkers that could withstand direct hits from 155mm shells were destroyed by concentrated fire that struck the same position repeatedly. By midnight, communication with my forward battalions had been severed. By 0200 hours, entire companies had been annihilated without firing a shot in defense. The ammunition expenditure was staggering. During the 12-hour bombardment preceding the actual river crossing, American artillery fired more shells than the entire German artillery arm possessed in all of Western Germany. This was not an exaggeration or propaganda. Post-war analysis of German logistics documents confirmed that American ammunition expenditure for the Rhine crossing exceeded total German artillery ammunition stocks west of the Elbe River. When American infantry crossed the Rhine, on the morning of March 24th, they encountered dazed survivors who offered minimal resistance. Ackermann's division, which had numbered approximately 8,000 combat-effective soldiers before the bombardment, was reduced to fewer than 1,500 men capable of organized resistance. The artillery had done its work with industrial efficiency. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the Rhine crossing, spectacular as it was, represented only the final demonstration of capabilities that had been shattering German defensive doctrine since Normandy. The fundamental problem German commanders faced was that American artillery had rendered traditional defensive tactics obsolete. This realization spread through the Wehrmacht during 1944, creating a crisis of doctrine that German staff officers struggled to address. General Major Heinz Kokott, who commanded the 26th Volksgrenadier Division during the Battle of the Bulge, captured this crisis in a post-action report written in January 1945. Our defensive doctrine assumes the ability to mass forces for counterattacks, to move reserves to threatened sectors, to maneuver units within our defensive depth. American artillery makes all of these actions suicidal. Any concentration of forces is immediately detected by their observation aircraft and subjected to devastating fire. Movement during daylight is impossible. Even night movement invites their artillery, as they fire on likely assembly areas and movement routes using pre-registered concentrations. We are reduced to static defense in dispersed positions, which violates every principle of our tactical doctrine. Kokott's frustration was shared across the Wehrmacht officer corps. German tactical excellence had always relied on aggressive counterattacks to restore defensive positions, on rapid concentration of forces at decisive points, on offensive spirit, even in defensive operations. American artillery denied all of these capabilities. German units attempting to mass for counterattacks were broken up by time-on-target strikes before they could even reach their line of departure. German reserves moving to threatened sectors were interdicted by artillery fire that seemed to anticipate their routes of march. German command posts attempting to coordinate defensive operations were struck by fire missions called in by observation aircraft or detected through signal intelligence. The rate of fire advantage compounded every other American superiority. German defensive plans typically assumed that artillery support would involve measured, carefully rationed fire. American artillery doctrine assumed unlimited ammunition and emphasized overwhelming fire as the primary killing mechanism. This philosophical difference had practical consequences that German defenders experienced in the most brutal way possible. Hauptmann Werner Schulze, whose company had been annihilated in the Hürtgen Forest, survived his wounds and returned to command a new company in February 1945. He was assigned to defensive positions near the Ruhr River, tasked with holding against the American advance. Schulze's battalion commander briefed all company commanders on new defensive tactics designed to minimize vulnerability to American artillery. Companies would disperse widely, avoid concentrations, dig deep shelters, minimize radio transmissions, move only at night, and prepare multiple alternate positions to confuse American targeting. "We implemented every recommended technique," Schulze wrote in his diary, We dispersed our positions over 800 meters of front instead of the usual 300. We dug shelters 2 meters deep with overhead cover. We moved only between 2200 hours and 0400 hours. We rotated positions every 48 hours. None of it mattered. On March 1, 1945, American artillery commenced preparatory fires for their assault across the Ruhr. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. They fired on every probable defensive position across the entire division sector. Our dispersion meant individual positions received fewer hits, but they fired enough shells to ensure every position was struck repeatedly. My company entered the bombardment with 94 men. When the American infantry attacked, I had 19 men capable of resistance. Schulze's mathematics were grimly accurate. American artillery doctrine allocated specific quantities of ammunition per target type. For a dispersed defensive position like Schulze's company area, fire planners would typically assign 50 to 100 rounds per 100 yards of front. This meant Schulze's 800-meter company position would receive between 800 and 1,600 shells during a preparatory bombardment. With 19 men dispersed across 800 meters, this translated to 8 to 16 shells per man, a density of fire that no field fortification could withstand. The German Army's tactical publications attempted to address this crisis. A directive issued by Oberkommando des Heeres in February 1945 acknowledged that the enemy's artillery superiority, particularly the American capacity to deliver overwhelming fire with minimal warning, requires fundamental revision of defensive doctrine. The directive recommended extreme dispersion, construction of deep shelters capable of withstanding repeated impacts, constant position changes to confuse enemy targeting, and acceptance that holding terrain had become secondary to preserving combat power. But these recommendations were impossible to implement effectively. Extreme dispersion degraded defensive firepower and made coordination nearly impossible. Deep shelters required engineering resources and time that German forces no longer possessed. Constant position changes exhausted troops already at the limits of endurance, and accepting that terrain could not be held violated the fundamental German military principle of holding ground at all costs. Oberst Wilhelm von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff for the 9th Panzer Division, wrote in his post-war analysis, "American artillery created a tactical environment where our doctrine became actively harmful. We trained our officers to concentrate forces at the decisive point, to counterattack aggressively, to maneuver within our defensive depth. Every one of these actions invited artillery fire that caused catastrophic casualties. Yet when we attempted defensive passivity and extreme dispersion, we lacked the firepower to stop American infantry advances. We were trapped between doctrines, each of which led to defeat." The psychological impact on German soldiers extended beyond immediate combat effects. Post-war medical studies of German prisoners revealed widespread symptoms consistent with what modern psychology would classify as combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder. But the specific characteristics of artillery-induced trauma differed from trauma caused by other weapons. Dr. Heinrich Weber, a Wehrmacht psychiatrist who treated soldiers at a field hospital near Aachen in late 1944, documented these differences in clinical notes later captured by American forces. Soldiers who experienced intense small-arms combat or even tank battles typically showed acute stress reactions that responded to rest and supportive treatment. Soldiers who survived American artillery bombardments showed different symptoms. They described a sense of utter helplessness, an inability to take any action to protect themselves. They reported intrusive memories not of specific moments but of overwhelming sensory experiences. The sound of simultaneous detonations, the pressure waves from multiple shells, the sight of entire positions vanishing in seconds. Many developed anticipatory anxiety that made them combat ineffective. They would freeze at the sound of any aircraft engine, believing American observation planes had spotted them and artillery would arrive within minutes. Weber's clinical observations were validated by unit commanders reporting decreased combat effectiveness even in units that had not yet been subjected to intensive American artillery fire. The reputation of American firepower had become a weapon in itself. German soldiers entering combat against American forces anticipated being subjected to overwhelming artillery bombardment. This anticipation created anxiety that degraded performance before the first shell fell. Feldwebel Hans Müller of the 352nd Infantry Division described this phenomenon in a letter to his wife, written in December 1944, shortly before his division was committed to the Ardennes offensive. "We have been told we are attacking the Americans. The men are afraid, not of American infantry whom we believe we can defeat, but of their artillery. We have heard from veterans of Normandy and the Falaise pocket what American artillery can do. They describe bombardments that arrive without warning and destroy entire companies in seconds. They say the Americans can put 10 shells in the air from a single gun before the first one lands. They say American ammunition is unlimited and their fire direction is perfect. I do not know if these stories are exaggerated, but they have affected morale. The men believe they are being sent to die under American artillery fire." Müller's unit attacked during the opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge. Initial reports suggested his battalion achieved local success in the first 48 hours, breaking through American defensive positions. But by December 19th, American artillery had reoriented to support defensive operations in the Bulge. Müller's battalion, attempting to exploit its initial breakthrough, was struck by a time-on-target mission involving an estimated 18 batteries over 100 guns. Müller survived but was captured 2 days later. His interrogation report noted, "Subject stated that his battalion received artillery fire of intensity beyond anything experienced by any man in the unit, including veterans of the Russian front. Subject estimated casualties exceeded 70% within the first 5 minutes of bombardment." The Battle of the Bulge provided the ultimate test of American artillery capability under adverse conditions. The German offensive achieved complete tactical surprise, attacking in weather that grounded American aircraft and through terrain that limited observation. American units were dispersed, understrength, and in some sectors comprised of inexperienced troops. These conditions should have favored German offensive operations. Yet, even with surprise and favorable conditions, the German offensive stalled within days, defeated primarily by American artillery. The defense of Elsenborn Ridge demonstrated American artillery at its most effective. Elements of the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held defensive positions on high ground overlooking German avenues of advance. The 5th Corps Artillery, coordinating fires from multiple divisions, created defensive concentrations of unprecedented density. On the night of December 17th to 18th, 1944, a single 5th Corps artillery battalion delivered 11,500 rounds in support of defensive positions. This represented more artillery ammunition than the entire 5th Panzer Army possessed for its initial attack. Obersturmbannführer Wilhelm Mohnke of the 1st SS Panzer Division led multiple attacks against Elsenborn Ridge during December 17 through December 20. His account, provided during post-war interrogation, conveyed the hopelessness of attacking into American defensive artillery. "We attacked with 2 battalions, approximately 1,500 men. The approaches to the American positions were completely covered by their artillery. We could not advance. We could not retreat. We could only endure the fire and watch our strength drain away. In 3 days of attacks, we inflicted minimal casualties on the American defenders. We suffered over 1,000 casualties, the vast majority from artillery." On December 20, I reported to division headquarters that further attacks were futile. The American artillery made the position impregnable. Elsenborn Ridge held throughout the Battle of the Bulge. The American defensive success there, replicated at Bastogne Street, Vith, and dozens of smaller positions, broke the German offensive. By early January 1945, German forces were in retreat, having accomplished nothing at catastrophic cost. Post-battle analysis identified American artillery as the decisive factor in the German defeat. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, reportedly told his staff in January 1945, "The American artillery was the difference. We achieved surprise. We concentrated our best divisions. We attacked in weather that favored us. None of it mattered because their artillery was everywhere, responding instantly to any threat, firing unlimited ammunition with devastating accuracy. We cannot defeat an enemy whose artillery makes our tactics impossible to execute. German senior officers' assessments of American artillery grew increasingly stark as the war progressed. These were not the complaints of defeated men seeking excuses. They were professional military analyses from officers who had spent decades studying warfare and who recognized when they faced systematic superiority that could not be overcome through tactical excellence or operational brilliance. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's foremost armor theorists and practitioners, wrote in March 1945, "The American way of war differs fundamentally from our own. We have relied on tactical skill, aggressive leadership, and superior training to offset material disadvantages. The Americans have created a system where material superiority is applied so systematically that tactical skill becomes irrelevant. Their artillery exemplifies this approach. They do not need better gunners than we have, though their fire direction is excellent. They simply bring more guns, more ammunition, and more coordination than we can possibly match. Against such systematic superiority, courage and skill are insufficient." In May 1945, after Germany's surrender, American intelligence officers conducted extensive debriefings of captured German military personnel. These interviews, preserved in the National Archives, provide detailed German perspectives on American military capabilities. The assessments of American artillery were remarkably consistent across all ranks and branches. A group of former German artillery officers assembled for technical debriefing in June 1945 were asked to compare American and German artillery. Their responses were candid. American fire direction was superior to ours. Their forward observation system was superior to ours. Their aerial reconnaissance was vastly superior to ours. Their ammunition supply was unlimited while ours was severely restricted. Their communications equipment was more reliable than ours. Their guns were fully mechanized while ours remained largely horse-drawn. In every measurable aspect, American artillery was superior. The only area where German artillery might claim equivalence was in the technical quality of individual gun tubes, and even there the difference was marginal. When asked what changes would have been necessary for German artillery to match American capabilities, the responses revealed the impossibility of the task. We would have needed to completely rebuild our artillery system. We would have needed thousands of trucks and tractors to mechanize our guns. We would have needed modern radio equipment for all forward observers. We would have needed to establish centralized fire direction capable of coordinating multiple batteries and divisions. We would have needed ammunition production increased by at least tenfold. We would have needed proximity fuses or equivalent technology. We would have needed comprehensive aerial observation and counter-battery capabilities. In short, we would have needed to become America to possess their industrial capacity, their organizational systems, and their material abundance. This was impossible. One German general, whose name was redacted in the declassified documents, stated bluntly, "We lost the war when we faced enemies who could outproduce us by factors of 5 or 10 in every category of military equipment. Your artillery exemplified this. You had more guns, better guns, unlimited ammunition, superior fire direction, and the organizational capability to mass fires across entire army fronts. We had courage and tactical skill. In modern industrial warfare, courage and skill are no longer sufficient. Your artillery proved this every day from Normandy to the Elbe." The legacy of American artillery dominance in World War II extended far beyond immediate battlefield results. The techniques developed at Fort Sill, centralized fire direction, time-on-target coordination, integration of aerial observation, emphasis on rapid response became the foundation for modern artillery doctrine worldwide. NATO artillery doctrine, developed during the Cold War, was essentially an evolution of American World War II practices. Even former enemies adopted these methods. The Bundeswehr, West Germany's armed forces established in the 1950s, incorporated many lessons from American artillery, including centralized fire direction, complete mechanization, and the ability to mass fires rapidly. But for the German soldiers who experienced American artillery in combat, the legacy was personal and traumatic. Post-war reunions of Wehrmacht veterans frequently included discussions of artillery experiences. Former soldiers compared notes on particularly devastating barrages, shared survival stories, and attempted to process experiences that had fundamentally altered their understanding of warfare. Werner Schulze, the Hauptmann whose company had been annihilated in the Hürtgen Forest, survived the war and returned to Germany. He attended several veterans' reunions in the 1950s and 60s. According to accounts from other attendees, Schulze rarely spoke about his combat experiences, except when specifically asked about American artillery. On those occasions, he would become animated, describing in detail the instantaneous, overwhelming fire that had destroyed his company in November 1944. He always came back to the same point, recalled one veteran who knew Schulze. He would say that everything they had learned about defensive tactics became useless against American artillery. You could not dig deep enough because they fired enough shells to collapse any shelter. You could not disperse enough because they fired enough shells to cover any dispersal. You could not move fast enough because their observation and fire direction were too rapid. Traditional defensive doctrine assumed limitations on artillery, limitations on ammunition, limitations on observation, limitations on coordination. The Americans had no limitations. Against an enemy with unlimited artillery, properly directed, no defense works. This assessment, no defense works, represented the ultimate judgment of German military professionals on American artillery. It was not an admission of cowardice or incompetence. It was recognition that American artillery had achieved something unprecedented in military history, the systematic negation of defensive advantage through the application of overwhelming firepower delivered with scientific precision. The transformation of warfare that American artillery represented became clear in retrospect. The era of tactical genius deciding battles through brilliant maneuver had ended. Modern industrial warfare required different capabilities: systematic organization, robust logistics, technological sophistication, and industrial production capacity at scales that made traditional military virtues insufficient for victory. Individual courage and tactical skill remained important, but they no longer determined outcomes. A smaller, highly trained, tactically brilliant army could not defeat a larger army supported by overwhelming firepower and unlimited supplies. This reality was painful for German military professionals to accept. The German military tradition emphasized individual excellence, tactical flexibility, and aggressive spirit. These values had served Germany well in earlier wars, but World War II demonstrated that warfare had evolved beyond what traditional virtues could achieve. The Germans had entered the war believing that superior training and tactical excellence could offset material disadvantages. They learned through painful experience that industrial capacity, systematically applied, could overwhelm traditional military excellence. The Battle of the Bulge crystallized this lesson. German forces executed a tactically sophisticated surprise attack that achieved initial success through operational skill and aggressive leadership. German soldiers fought with courage and determination. German tactical leadership was generally excellent. Yet the offensive failed not primarily because of German tactical or operational errors, but because American material superiority, exemplified by artillery, made German success impossible regardless of tactical excellence. From the second day of the offensive onward, American artillery grew progressively more effective as fire direction centers re-established communications and core assets were brought to bear. By the third day, German advances were being contained by artillery fires that German forces could not suppress or avoid. By the end of the first week, German offensive momentum had stalled not because German soldiers lost courage or German tanks ran out of fuel, though fuel was indeed a critical problem, but because American artillery made further advances prohibitively costly. The systematic nature of American artillery superiority meant that German tactical innovations could not overcome it. When German forces concentrated for attacks, artillery dispersed them. When German forces dispersed to avoid artillery, they lacked the concentration necessary for successful attacks. When German artillery fired to support attacks, American counter-battery fire silenced it. When German forces achieved local tactical success, artillery prevented exploitation. The system was self-correcting and adaptive, responding to German actions faster than German forces could capitalize on opportunities. This systemic superiority represented the true American advantage. Individual American soldiers might have been less experienced than German veterans. Individual American tanks might have been inferior to German Panthers and Tigers. Individual American tactical decisions might have been less sophisticated than German operational planning. But the American military system, with artillery as its primary killing mechanism, was superior to the German system in ways that individual excellence could not overcome. The Germans had built their military around the concept of the decisive battle, where superior tactics and fighting spirit would win victory. The Americans had built their military around the concept of systematic attrition, where superior resources and organization would grind down the enemy. In every major engagement from Normandy to the Elbe, these two approaches met in their purest form. German tactical excellence versus American systematic superiority. The outcome consistently demonstrated which approach was more effective in. On a spring morning in 1946, Werner Schulze stood in what had been his company's assembly area in the Hürtgen Forest. The war had been over for nearly a year. The forest was silent except for wind in the trees. Schulze walked through the position where his company had been annihilated in those 3 seconds of perfectly coordinated American artillery fire in November 1944. A journalist interviewing German veterans for a magazine article accompanied Schulze that day. The journalist later wrote, "Schulze showed me where his command post had been, where his platoons had assembled, where the attack was to begin. He pointed to crater after crater, some large enough to swallow a truck. He estimated we counted over 200 craters in the company assembly area alone. Then he said something I will never forget. He said, 'No defense works against this. We thought we were professional soldiers, masters of our craft. The Americans taught us that in modern war, industrial systems defeat warrior traditions. 10 rounds per minute, from hundreds of guns, with unlimited ammunition and perfect coordination. Against such firepower, courage means nothing. Skill means nothing. All that matters is who can bring more shells to the target faster. We could not compete. We were finished the moment the Americans learned to make their artillery fire like a machine. The craters in the Hürtgen Forest eventually filled with water and vegetation. The scars of war faded from the landscape. But the lesson remained. American artillery in World War II had demonstrated the decisive importance of systematic superiority over individual excellence, of industrial capacity over tactical brilliance, of organizational efficiency over warrior spirit. The shells arriving simultaneously in pre-dawn darkness had announced a new era of warfare, an era where victory went to nations that could best transform industrial capacity into coordinated military power, an era where traditional defensive doctrine became obsolete in the face of firepower delivered without limitation or warning, an era where German officers, surveying the destruction of their units, could only conclude what Werner Schulze had concluded in November 1944. No defense works. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.